Perquisites, commonly known as perks, are special benefits that executives get that the rest of the workforce doesn't, and they confer some sort of personal benefit. They're disclosable as compensation in a company's proxy statement filed with the SEC and delivered to shareholders. And if you're new to this area, it can be challenging to determine what is a perk and what's a true business expense, because you'll come across quite a few items that have both a personal and a business element to them. And this confusion is compounded because the IRS rules about what is taxable or not doesn't match the SEC rules about what is disclosable in the proxy statement. The SEC has said as much, and they don't care about the discrepancy. So how to sort this all out? Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of yous. In this Vid-Guide, I'm going to point you to where you need to go to help you figure out what is a perk. I've several dozen other Vid-Guides that specifically delve into common perk types, and if you do a YouTube search with hashtag perks, hashtag zippypoint, you're going to find those. Of course, you can also go to zippypoint.com. So there are four sources of SEC's guidance to help you evaluate whether something is a perk or not. Then you should consider looking at what other companies disclose as perks as well as talk to your colleagues about what companies might not be disclosing because those perk-like items are floating out there in a nebulous gray area. Or maybe those companies are just willing to push the envelope. It's good to know where you stand against your peers. So number one, the SEC's regulations. First is the SEC's regulation itself. It's item 402C, Roman numeral 9A of Regulation SK, which states that perks are to be disclosed for a named executive officer known as an NEO in the all other compensation column of the summary compensation table. For a director, it's the same all other compensation column, but it's for the director's compensation table. These tables are part of the extensive pay disclosures that companies make in their proxies these days. The pay disclosures alone often are the bulk of the disclosure in a proxy. It could take 30 or more pages of the proxy. It's quite lengthy. And the summary compensation table is arguably the centerpiece of the pay disclosures itself, that along with the CD&A section. And I have separate Vid-Guides about CD&A and summary compensation table and anything related to the proxy at all. You go to zippypoint.com for that. So instruction 4 to the sub-item states that an NEO's perk doesn't need to be included in the summary compensation table if the aggregate amount is less than $10,000. If the amount is more than $10,000 for an NEO or a director, then each perk, regardless of its amount, must be identified by type. Plus, if the perk exceeds the greater of $25,000 or 10% of the total amount of perks for that insider, the perk must be quantified and disclosed in a footnote. So this is a big deal. You have to look at the footnotes of these tables as well as the amounts in the all other compensation table. That's what your investors, the proxy advisors are doing as well. Instruction 4 goes on to state that perks are to be valued on the basis of the aggregate incremental cost to the company, the aggregate incremental cost. And if footnote quantification of a perk is required, the company must describe its method for computing this aggregate incremental cost in that footnote. 2, the SEC's 2006 adopting release. So the second source of the SEC's guidance is the SEC's adopting release when it overhauled item 402 of Regulation SK, the executive pay rules, back in 2006. And this adopting release is important for a number of reasons. One, it actually lists a number of non-exclusive items that the SEC believes are perks, thereby removing any ambiguity for these things. So this is club memberships, finance and tax advice, personal travel, personal use of company property, housing and living expenses, and etc. Then the adopting release contains a two-step principles-based framework that truly is the guiding light for determining whether something is a perk. So this is not in the SEC's rules. This is in the adopting release. That's why it's so important. So the two-pronged principle-based framework is: one, the item is not a perk or personal benefit if it is intricately and directly related to the performance of the executive's duties. And second, otherwise, an item is a perk if it confers a direct or indirect benefit that has a personal aspect without regard to whether it may be provided for some business reason and for the convenience of the company, unless it's on a non-discriminatory basis to all employees. It's given to all employees. The SEC's adopting release goes on to provide quite a bit of gloss about what this framework means. So step 1 is the item integrally and directly related to the performance of the executive's duties? If the answer is yes, if an item is integrally and directly related, you see I'm saying these terms a lot, they're important terms, then the item is not a perk, even if it involves a personal benefit, and no further analysis then is necessary. No disclosure is required. So again, this concept of integrally and directly related to the performance of an executive's duties is important, but it's pretty narrowly construed and represents a high threshold, as you'll see if you watch my Vid-Guides about individual specific perk types. There's like, I think 2-3 dozen Vid-Guides I've made where I delve into specific Vid-Guides. Some of these Vid-Guides are like 2 minutes long. They're really short. A lot of items fall into the perk category that might surprise you if you didn't know the rules. If the answer is no to this step, if the item is not integrally and directly related to the performance of an executive's duties, then and only then you go on to the second step of the analysis. So step 2, does the item confer a direct or indirect benefit that has a personal aspect without regard to whether it might be provided for some business reason or convenience of the company? If the answer is yes, then the item is considered a perk unless it's generally available on a non-discriminatory basis to all employees. So as for whether an item is generally available on a non-discriminatory basis to all employees, the SEC has said that means it's available to all employees to whom it's lawfully may be provided. So merely providing a benefit to employees in the same job category or at the same pay scale does not meet the standard. It has to be widely available. If the answer is no to this step, the item is not a perk and no disclosure would be required. So I really urge you to read the SEC's adopting release. It really drives this two-step framework home. It's an easy read, and there's no substitute for reading something that the SEC has put out itself rather than relying on what others have written about it or just merely watching a video about it. 3, the CorpFin's, the SEC staff's Division of Corporation Finance, they have a set of compliance and disclosure interpretations, CDIs, and given actually a number of staff speeches back shortly after this 2006 reform was. This is the third source of the SEC's guidance from the SEC staff. 2 compliance and disclosure interpretations, and one is about the timing of gross-up disclosure. The other states that if an executive fully reimburses a company for a perk, it doesn't need to be disclosed as a perk. So if you partially reimburse, the perk would be just that component for which the company didn't reimburse. So that's an important interp. That interp indicates that if perks have no value, no incremental cost, it still has to be disclosed as a perk. So if an example of this is a vendor gift, it doesn't cost the company anything, but you still got this personal item in your capacity as an executive of the company. So you're gonna have to still disclose that you got this perk, even though the value you're putting, in the table in the all other compensation column is 0. You're still disclosing it as a perk. So I should mention that, like I said, the SEC staff, particularly the directors of the Division of Corporation, have made a few speeches in this area. It's specifically John White. And this John White's speeches amplify what the SEC is looking for. So here's a speech from September 2006 entitled Principles Matter. That was delivered at a conference by John White. That's definitely worth reading. And the SEC has a few other speeches like that in written form up on their website. 4, SEC enforcement actions. So the fourth source of the SEC's guidance comes from the occasional enforcement action that that's about faulty or non-existent disclosure about perks. And the SEC brings one of these enforcement actions every year or two, on average over the last decade or so. Some of these enforcement actions really do move the needle in what companies do. For example, the 2008 enforcement action against Dow Chemical led many companies to enhance how they document, how they log travel-related items to capture a more accurate picture of their aggregate incremental costs. 5, peer disclosures and non-disclosures. So one last source to consider, what are other companies doing? Even with all this guidance from the SEC, there still remains some gray areas. So some areas where a company is different, what the SEC wants, this is a principles-based framework, so that happens. So looking at other disclosures will give you half the picture, but you also need to talk to your colleagues at other companies to see what items that might arguably be considered perks that they're not disclosing. That where's the line? Where's the envelope? This will help give you a sense of whether your own practices are too risky or perhaps too conservative.